I moved into Brooke's house because I was desperate. That's the simplest way to explain it. At 26, I'd imagined my life looking very different. I thought I'd have a decent apartment, maybe a stable relationship, definitely more than $300 in my checking account. Instead, I was hauling 2 duffel bags and a cracked guitar case up the walkway of a narrow gray house on the edge of town while trying not to panic about how badly everything had fallen apart. The ad had been simple. Room for rent. Quiet house. No parties. No smoking. Serious inquiries only. The rent was low enough to feel suspicious, but when I called, the man on the phone sounded calm and direct. "My name's Brooks," he'd said. "If you're looking for chaos, this isn't the place." At the time, chaos was exactly what I was trying to escape. So there I was, standing on his porch in cold October rain, wondering if I'd made another mistake. The front door opened before I could knock. And there he was. Brooks looked older than me by at least 10 years, maybe more. Tall, broad shoulders, dark sweater rolled up at the forearms. The kind of face that looked permanently serious even when he wasn't angry. His eyes moved over me once, quick and assessing. "You're Hunter." "Yeah." "You're late." I blinked. "By like 3 minutes." "That's still late." "Okay, great. One of those guys." He stepped aside anyway. Shoes off and sighed. The house smelled like coffee and cedarwood. Clean. Not fancy clean. Controlled clean. Everything had a place. The books on the shelves were perfectly aligned. The kitchen counters were empty except for a bowl of fruit that looked weirdly organized. I suddenly became painfully aware that one of my duffel bags was ripped open at the side and spilling t-shirts. Brooks noticed too. He didn't comment. "Kitchen's there," he said, pointing. "Bathroom upstairs. Your room is the second door on the left. Rent's due on Fridays. Quiet after 10. You always talk like a rulebook?" His expression didn't change. "You always joke when you're nervous?" That shut me up. He walked ahead of me upstairs while I dragged my stuff behind him. The room itself was small but decent. Bed, desk, window facing the street. "It locks," he said. "I don't go into tenants' rooms." Comforting. "I'm not trying to comfort you." Something about the way he said it almost made me laugh. Almost. He stood in the doorway while I looked around. "No overnight guests," he added. "Clean up after yourself. If you break something, tell me immediately. You got a list printed somewhere?" "Yes." I stared at him. "I'm kidding," he said flatly. The problem was, he didn't sound like he was kidding. After a long silence, he finally nodded once. "You seem decent enough," he said. "That matters more than punctuality." Then he left. No welcome speech. No small talk. Just footsteps disappearing down the stairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet house around me. At the time, I thought Brooks was cold. I didn't understand, yet that some people build their entire lives around staying carefully contained. And I definitely didn't know that one night, months later, he'd sit across from me in that spotless kitchen and quietly confess why he never married. Or why the answer would change the way I looked at him forever. Living with Brooks felt like living with a man who had declared war on unpredictability. By the third day, I knew exactly when he woke up, when he left for work, and when he returned home. 6:30 in the morning, every day, without fail. Coffee brewed at 6:35. Front door locked at 7 sharp. At first, I found it annoying. Then I started finding it weirdly comforting. After the disaster my life had become over the last year, there was something steady about him. Reliable. Even his silence felt structured. Still, Brooks himself was almost impossible to read. Sometimes he acted like I barely existed. Other times, he'd notice tiny things that made no sense for someone supposedly so detached. Like the night I came home soaked from rain after missing the last bus. I walked into the kitchen freezing, trying not to drip water everywhere, and found a towel folded neatly on the counter. No note. No explanation. Brooks was sitting at the table reading something on his tablet. "You're dripping on the floor," he said without looking up. I grabbed the towel. "Thanks. You'll get sick." "You always this warm and nurturing?" That finally made him glance at me. "I'm practical," he replied. "You getting pneumonia would become my problem." I laughed under my breath. "Right. Of course." But later that night, when I found a cup of hot tea left outside my bedroom door, I started realizing Brooks' version of caring looked very different from everyone else's. Subtle. Quiet. Like he hoped kindness wouldn't be noticed if he delivered it carefully enough. A week after moving in, I learned Brooks cooked every night at exactly 8 o'clock. And I mean every night. Real meals, too. Not frozen garbage like I survived on. The first time I wandered into the kitchen while he was cooking, he looked genuinely irritated by my existence. What? He asked. You cook like somebody's disappointed mother. I cook like an adult. Ouch. He returned to chopping vegetables with terrifying precision. I leaned against the doorway watching him for a second. You ever relax? Yes. When? When you're not talking. I grinned despite myself. That earned me the smallest eye twitch from him. But then, after a pause, he said, There's enough for two if you want some. That surprised me enough to actually shut up. We ate mostly in silence. Not awkward silence, exactly. Just Brooks' silence. He sat perfectly straight at the table while I slowly realized this might have been the first homemade meal I'd eaten in months. This is really good, I admitted. I know. I stared at him. Was that confidence? Dry humor? Accidental arrogance? With Brooks, it was impossible to tell. You always this humble. I spent an hour making braised short ribs, he said calmly. False modesty would be ridiculous. I laughed so hard I almost choked. And for the first time since moving in, Brooks smiled. It was quick, small, but it completely changed his face. That was the dangerous thing about Brooks. The softer moments felt earned, like glimpses behind a locked door. Over the next few weeks, we settled into something that almost resembled friendship. Almost. I learned he worked as an architect downtown, that he liked jazz but hated modern country music with actual passion, that he alphabetized his spice rack, which I openly mocked for 10 straight minutes. You're deeply unsettling, I told him. You leave cabinet doors open, he replied. We all have flaws. Fair point. But the strangest thing about Brooks wasn't the strictness. It was how little personal life he seemed to have. No friends visiting. No dates. No family calling. Nothing. The house felt like it existed entirely around him, sealed off from the rest of the world. One Friday night, I came downstairs around midnight for water and found him sitting alone in the dark living room. No TV. No music. Just silence. He looked up when he heard me. Couldn't sleep? I asked. I was. That sounds medically concerning. I woke up. I grabbed water from the kitchen, but something about the way he sat there bothered me. Tense. Like his mind was somewhere ugly. You okay? Brooks looked almost surprised by the question. Then he gave the same answer people give when they don't want honesty. I'm fine. I leaned against the doorway. You know, I said carefully. For somebody so obsessed with rules, you're terrible at lying. That made his jaw tighten slightly. For a second, I thought I'd pushed too far. But then he surprised me again. You ask a lot of questions, he said quietly. Occupational hazard. You don't have an occupation. Rude. A long silence stretched between us. Then Brooks looked toward the dark window and said something so quietly I almost missed it. The house gets loud at night. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? But he shook his head once. Nothing. And just like that, the wall came back up. He stood, turned off the lamp beside him, and headed upstairs without another word, leaving me alone in the dark living room, suddenly realizing something important. Brooks wasn't lonely because he disliked people. He was lonely because he was hiding from something. And I was starting to want to know what it was. The first real crack in Brooks happened because of a burnt grilled cheese sandwich, which sounds ridiculous considering how serious he usually was. It was late November by then, cold enough that the windows fogged over at night. I'd been working temporary shifts at a bookstore downtown and came home exhausted, starving, and in a terrible mood after getting yelled at by a customer who thought I personally controlled inventory shortages. Brooks was already home. Of course he was. He sat at the kitchen table with reading glasses low on his nose, reviewing blueprints while jazz played softly from the speaker near the sink. The entire scene looked aggressively mature. Meanwhile, I walked in carrying gas station chips and emotional instability. You look terrible, Brooks said without looking up. Thank you. That's healing. You smell like snow and bad decisions. That one's fair. I dumped my bag on the counter and started making the saddest grilled cheese in human history while Brooks continued working in silence. Then my phone buzzed. Another rejection email. Another "we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Something inside me just dropped. I stared at the message too long. Long enough to forget the pan. Smoke started rising a second later. Oh, come on, I muttered, lunging for it. Brooks looked up immediately. The smoke alarm exploded to life. And I swear to God, I have never seen a man move faster in my entire life. Brooks stood so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, grabbed a towel, shut off the burner, opened windows, and silenced the alarm with terrifying efficiency. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds. But afterward, he stood there breathing harder than he should have been. Way harder. I blinked at him. "You okay?" Brooks kept his back to me. "Fine." Except he absolutely wasn't. His shoulders were rigid. His hand still gripped the counter too tightly. "It was just smoke," I said carefully. "I know." But his voice sounded distant. Controlled in the way people sound when they're trying very hard not to lose control. I watched him for a second longer, then quietly said, "Brooks." That finally made him turn around. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely shaken. Not annoyed. Not strict. Scared. "It's nothing," he said quickly. Which, obviously, meant it wasn't nothing. The kitchen stayed silent except for cold air blowing through the open window. Then Brooks rubbed a hand across his jaw and exhaled slowly. "My ex used to burn things constantly," he said. I froze. Not because of the sentence itself, because it was the first time Brooks had ever voluntarily mentioned another person in his life. He seemed to realize what he'd said immediately afterward. His expression closed almost instantly. But it was too late now. "Your ex?" I repeated carefully. Brooks stepped away from the counter. "Forget it. No chance. Hunter, you literally just revealed you had a mysterious, tragic backstory after 2 months of acting like a retired spy. That is not what happened. It is absolutely what happened." Despite everything, I caught the faintest flicker of amusement in his face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared again. Brooks moved toward the sink, rinsing the ruined pan like the conversation was over. But something had shifted, because now I knew there had been someone. Someone important enough that Brooks still reacted to smoke like it carried ghosts inside it. "You were married?" I asked quietly. That stopped him completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we'd shared before. Finally, without turning around, he answered, "No." The word was calm. Too calm. And suddenly I understood that wasn't the full answer. Not even close. Brooks dried his hands slowly before facing me again. His expression had gone unreadable. "We should eat something that isn't charcoal," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed softly. "It isn't." Then he opened the fridge and started pulling ingredients out with deliberate focus, like routine could save him from the conversation. But while he cooked, I kept catching tiny things. The stiffness in his shoulders. The way he drifted somewhere else whenever silence lasted too long. And only once I saw him glance toward the hallway with an expression so sad it genuinely startled me. That was the moment I realized something else, too. Brooks didn't avoid talking about love because he'd never had it. He avoided it because he had. And whatever happened afterward had hollowed him out so deeply that he'd built his entire life around never feeling it again. After that night, Brooks became careful again. Not colder exactly, just aware. Like he regretted letting me see too much. For the next week, every conversation felt balanced on the edge of something neither of us fully acknowledged. He still cooked dinner. Still corrected me when I left lights on downstairs. Still gave me those dry, unimpressed looks whenever I said something stupid. But now I noticed the pauses. The moments where he'd almost say something personal before stopping himself. And once you notice someone holding themselves back, you can't unsee it. One Sunday evening, I came home to find Brooks fixing the hallway light. Standing on a ladder in dark jeans and an old long-sleeve shirt with the sleeves pushed up, which honestly should have been illegal for a man his age to pull off that well. "You know," I said, dropping my keys into the bowl by the door, "you could just hire someone for this." "I am someone." That sounded deeply philosophical. It wasn't. I leaned against the wall watching him work. Brooks glanced down briefly. "You had another interview today." Not a question. "Yeah." "How'd it go?" I shrugged. "Think I bombed it." "You say that after every interview." "Because I keep bombing them." "You're dramatic. You're emotionally constipated." "We all have things." That earned me a long look from the ladder. Then, somehow, unbelievably, Brooks laughed. Not the small, almost smiles from before. An actual laugh. Low and brief, but real. And it completely ruined me. Because suddenly I could see the version of him that existed before whatever happened. The version someone probably fell in love with. The thought hit me so unexpectedly that I immediately looked away. Dangerous territory. Very dangerous territory. Brooks climbed down from the ladder a second later. "You'll find something eventually," he said. "You sound suspiciously supportive." "I'm trying something new." "Well, stop. It's unsettling." His mouth twitched slightly. Then his expression faded again. I mean it, Hunter. Something about the way he said my name made the air feel heavier. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed on the table nearby. Brooks glanced at the screen, and everything in him changed. Not dramatically, subtly, but enough that I noticed immediately. His shoulders tightened. His expression flattened. The warmth disappeared. He declined the call without answering. You okay? I asked carefully. Fine. That word again. A minute later, the phone buzzed once more. Same reaction. This time I caught a name on the screen before it disappeared. Ethan. Brooks immediately turned the phone face down. Interesting. You gonna answer your secret admirer? I asked lightly. No. That sounded personal. It is. Well, that definitely got my attention. Brooks moved toward the kitchen, clearly trying to end the conversation. But curiosity had already taken hold. Your ex? I asked carefully. He stopped walking. Didn't turn around. Yes. The honesty surprised me enough that I stayed quiet. Brooks rested one hand against the counter for a moment before speaking again. We were together a long time. Something in his voice made my chest tighten unexpectedly. How long? 12 years. Jesus. I stared at him. Suddenly Brooks made more sense. The silence. The routines. The controlled loneliness. You don't build a life that rigid unless something once broke it apart completely. What happened? I asked softly. Brooks gave a humorless smile without looking at me. That's a very long story. I'm unemployed. I have time. That almost got another laugh out of him. Almost. Instead, he grabbed a glass from the cabinet and poured water slowly, thoughtfully. Then he said something that made the room go completely still. He wanted to get married. I frowned slightly. And you didn't? Brooks looked down at the glass in his hand for so long that I thought he might not answer. Finally, quietly, he said, I did. That surprised me, because somehow I'd expected the opposite. Expected Brooks to be the emotionally unavailable one, the difficult one. But, I asked gently. Brooks leaned back against the counter. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. He asked me 3 different times over 2 years, he said. And every time, I told him to wait. His voice stayed calm, but I could hear something underneath it now. Regret. Sharp enough to survive years. Why? I asked. Brooks gave a quiet exhale through his nose. Because I thought if I delayed it long enough, I could protect us from what came after. I didn't understand. After what? He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And suddenly he seemed older than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. Like he'd been carrying something heavy alone for too long. My parents hated him, Brooks said quietly. My father stopped speaking to me for almost a year after he found out about us. I stayed completely still. He thought marriage would make it real. Brooks continued. Permanent. Public. Impossible to hide from people. And that scared you. Yes. The honesty in that single word hit harder than I expected. Brooks rubbed tiredly at his jaw. I kept telling myself I was being practical, careful, that eventually things would settle down and I'd propose properly when life was less complicated. His expression twisted slightly. But life doesn't wait for people to become less afraid. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the jazz music had ended somewhere during the conversation. What happened to him? I asked softly. Brooks looked toward the dark kitchen window. And for a second, I genuinely thought he might not answer at all. Then he said quietly, he got tired of waiting for me to choose him out loud. And somehow that hurt to hear more than I expected it to. The next morning felt strange. Not awkward exactly. Just charged. Brooks was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed for work, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms while coffee brewed beside him. Everything about him looked normal. Too normal. Like the conversation from the backyard had never happened. Meanwhile, I barely slept. Because now every interaction with him carried weight. Every glance. Every pause. Every softened expression. And worst of all, I didn't think Brooks was completely unaware of it anymore. Morning, I muttered. You look tired, he replied immediately. You emotionally devastated me in 40-degree weather. That seems dramatic. You proposed 6 months too late to the love of your life, Brooks. He went still for half a second, then calmly handed me a mug of coffee. You exaggerate for sport. You repress feelings for sport. We all cope differently. That actually earned the faintest smile from him. Dangerous. Very dangerous. I took the coffee carefully. Did he ever respond? I asked quietly. Brooks knew exactly who I meant. He leaned one hip against the counter, gaze lowering briefly to his cup. Yes. And a long pause. Then Brooks said, he told me he believed I loved him. Something tightened painfully in my chest already. But he didn't think I'd ever stop being afraid long enough to love him properly. God. Brooks gave a small nod like he agreed with the statement, even now. I think that was the worst part, he admitted quietly. Knowing he was right. The kitchen fell silent. I looked at him standing there in soft morning light, holding coffee with both hands like he needed the warmth. And suddenly Brooks didn't feel intimidating anymore. He felt lonely. Profoundly lonely. And for one reckless second, I wanted to cross the kitchen and hug him. Which was a terrible idea. Instead, I said carefully, people screw things up when they're scared. Yes, Brooks replied softly. But eventually the fear becomes a decision. That sentence stayed with me all day. Especially because I had the uncomfortable feeling Brooks wasn't only talking about his past anymore. That night, I came home later than usual after drinks with coworkers from the bookstore. Not drunk, just warm and loose enough that my thoughts felt less guarded. The house was dark except for the lamp in the living room. Brooks sat on the couch reading. Of course he was. You know, I announced while shrugging off my jacket. One day I'm going to come home and find you doing something unhinged. Brooks looked up calmly. Define unhinged. Watching reality television. Owning colorful pillows. Smiling without being legally required to. I smile constantly. You absolutely do not. I smiled in March. I laughed despite myself and dropped onto the opposite side of the couch. The room settled into comfortable quiet after that. And weirdly, that had become my favorite thing about living with Brooks. Silence with him didn't feel empty. It felt shared. A few minutes later, he closed his book. You've been avoiding eye contact all evening. I immediately looked at him. Have not. You're doing it now out of spite. Correct. Brooks studied me carefully for a second too long. Then he asked quietly, what changed? There it was. The question we'd both been circling. I swallowed once. Nothing. I mean it. You're a very poor liar, Hunter. That should have felt teasing. Instead, it felt dangerously intimate. The room suddenly seemed smaller somehow. Brooks leaned back slightly against the couch cushions, eyes still fixed on me. You've been nervous around me since the backyard conversation, he said calmly. Maybe I'm cold. You're sweating. Traitorous body. I let out a quiet groan and covered my face briefly with one hand. This is humiliating. I haven't even said anything yet. That's what makes it worse. For the first time in weeks, Brooks looked genuinely caught off guard. Not because I'd admitted anything directly, but because I think he finally understood there was actually something to admit. The realization visibly unsettled him. He looked away first, and somehow that hurt more than if he'd rejected me outright. Hunter, he said carefully, I don't think it would be wise for you to confuse loneliness with attachment. Ouch. I stared at him. That's not what this is. Brooks' jaw tightened slightly. You're young. I'm 26, not 12. You're also kind, he continued quietly, like he hadn't heard me. And I've spent a long time being alone. Sometimes people mistake being understood for. Don't. I interrupted softly. He stopped immediately, because now I was angry. Not explosive angry. Worse. Hurt angry. You don't get to decide my feelings for me, I said quietly. Brooks looked genuinely stricken by that. I wasn't trying to. I know exactly what you were trying to do. Protect me. Push me away gently. Convince both of us this wasn't real before it could become dangerous. And suddenly I understood something awful. Brooks still loved people by retreating from them. Even now. Especially now. The silence stretched painfully between us. Finally, Brooks stood. Slowly. I should go upstairs, he said quietly. Coward, I thought immediately. But the worst part was that he looked like he hated himself for leaving even as he did it. Before disappearing into the hallway, he paused once. Without turning around, he said, You deserve someone who doesn't hesitate. Then he walked upstairs, leaving me alone on the couch with my heartbeat going painfully uneven. Because the terrifying thing was, I didn't think Brooks understood yet that he was already hesitating because he cared too much. For the next 2 days, Brooks avoided being alone with me. Not obviously. That was the frustrating part. He still spoke to me normally. Still asked if I'd eaten. Still left half the kitchen light on for me when I worked late shifts at the bookstore. But now his timing had changed. If I was downstairs, he found reasons to be upstairs. If we ended up in the kitchen together, he kept conversations short. Controlled. Careful. Like he was trying to put something back into a box after realizing it had escaped. And honestly, It pissed me off. Because once you know someone feels something, distance stops feeling polite. It starts feeling cowardly. By Thursday night, I was officially done pretending not to notice. I came home around 9 and found Brooks in the dining room reviewing work files with reading glasses on again. God, even his stress looked organized. He glanced up briefly when I walked in. "You're late. You said that the first day I moved in. It was annoying then too. You forgot your umbrella." I blinked. Sure enough, mine sat folded neatly beside him on the table. "You noticed?" "It was blocking the hallway." Liar. Brooks looked back at his paperwork immediately, but I caught at the tiny shift in his mouth. The almost smile. And suddenly the frustration inside me cracked open. "Why are you avoiding me?" The question landed hard in the quiet room. Brooks slowly removed his glasses. "I'm not." "You absolutely are." Silence. Then, "I'm trying to be responsible." I laughed once, sharp and humorless. "That's what you call this?" "Yes." "No," I said quietly. "This is you getting scared and pretending it's maturity." That hit him. I could tell immediately. Brooks leaned back slowly in his chair, studying me with that unreadable expression again. "You think this is simple because you're younger than me," he said carefully. "No. I think you overcomplicate everything because you're terrified of wanting things." His jaw tightened. "That's unfair." "Is it?" The room felt suddenly too warm. I stepped closer before I could stop myself. "You know what your problem is, Brooks? I assume you're about to tell me. You keep acting like hurting yourself first somehow protects everybody else." That made something flicker across his face. Pain. Real pain. But I wasn't finished now. "You loved someone for 12 years and still convinced yourself staying emotionally halfway hidden was noble somehow. That's enough." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." Brooks stood abruptly. Not angry exactly. Worse. Overwhelmed. "You think you understand this because you've heard a few stories about my past," he said, voice tighter now. "But you don't understand what it costs people to be tied to someone who lives in fear all the time. And you don't understand that pushing people away still hurts them anyway." That silence afterward felt enormous. Brooks looked at me like I'd hit somewhere dangerously accurate. Then he said softly, "I would hurt you." The honesty in it nearly destroyed me. Not because it sounded manipulative, because it sounded sincere. I stared at him for a long second, then quietly asked, "Do you actually believe that? Or do you just believe you deserve to be alone now?" Brooks froze completely. There it was. The real wound underneath everything else. Not fear. Punishment. He still blamed himself for Daniel. Still carried that relationship like evidence against his own happiness. The realization made my chest ache. Brooks looked away first. And suddenly he seemed exhausted again. Older. "I don't know how to do this correctly," he admitted quietly. The anger drained out of me instantly after that. Because that was the most honest thing he'd said yet. I stepped closer slowly. Close enough now that I could see the tension in his face. "You don't have to do it perfectly," I said softly. Brooks looked at me then. Really looked at me. And something changed. I felt it immediately. The room went painfully quiet. His eyes dropped briefly to my mouth before lifting again, like the movement happened accidentally. Neither of us breathed for a second. "Hunter," he said quietly. But this time my name didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like restraint barely holding together. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Brooks wasn't pulling away because he felt nothing. He was pulling away because he felt too much already. My heartbeat went uneven. "So what now?" I asked softly. Brooks stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, painfully carefully, he reached out and touched my wrist. Just that. Barely anything. But the contact felt electric. His thumb moved once against my skin before he seemed to catch himself. The restraint in that tiny movement almost hurt more than if he'd kissed me. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. And for the first time since I met him, Brooks looked less like a man hiding from me, and more like a man losing the fight against himself. After that night, the entire house felt different. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing did. Brooks didn't suddenly kiss me. I didn't confess some devastating speech about being hopelessly in love with him. There was no cinematic moment where everything finally snapped into place. Instead, things became quieter, and somehow, infinitely more intense. Because now the truth existed between us openly. Brooks could no longer pretend he felt nothing, and I could no longer pretend I wasn't waiting for him to stop running from it. The problem was, Brooks had spent years turning restraint into instinct. So even after touching my wrist like it physically cost him something, he retreated again. just not very well this time. 3 days later, I came downstairs unable to sleep and found him standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning drinking water in complete darkness. He looked startled when he saw me, which was new. Brooks was never startled. Insomnia? I asked softly. Yes. Thought only emotionally tortured Victorian men wandered houses at night. I'm expanding my horizons. I smiled faintly and walked farther into the kitchen. The air between us immediately tightened. Neither of us seemed to know what to do with normal proximity anymore. Brooks set his glass down carefully. You should sleep, he said. You first. I'm trying. Something about his voice made me study him more carefully. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like he'd been arguing with himself for days and losing. I leaned against the counter quietly. You know, I said softly, you're allowed to want things without immediately turning it into a moral failure. Brooks closed his eyes briefly. That's not how this feels. How does it feel? He laughed once under his breath. 12 kinds of irresponsible. I stared at him. You really think caring about someone is dangerous? Yes. The immediate honesty startled me. Brooks rubbed tiredly at his jaw before continuing. Because every time I've loved someone, eventually they paid for it. That's not true. It is to me. God. There it was again. That guilt. Like he genuinely believed he ruined people simply by being afraid at the wrong moments. I stepped closer before thinking too hard about it. Brooks. He looked up slowly. And suddenly we were standing much too close for two people pretending this wasn't happening. The kitchen felt painfully quiet around us. I'm not Daniel, I said gently. Something shifted in his expression immediately. Pain, regret, affection, all tangled together. I know, he said quietly. And you're not the same person you were with him either. That hit him harder. I could tell. Brooks looked down briefly, like he physically couldn't hold eye contact through that sentence. I wasted so much time, he admitted softly. You were scared. I was selfish. No, I said firmly. You were human. His eyes lifted back to mine then, and the look on his face nearly wrecked me. Because for the first time since I'd met him, Brooks looked at me like he wanted something openly, not hidden behind restraint, not disguised as concern, not buried under practicality, just wanted. The realization made my pulse jump hard. Neither of us moved. Then Brooks said quietly, You should not be looking at me like this. I swallowed once. Probably not. That wasn't encouragement. I know. His mouth twitched despite himself, and suddenly the tension became unbearable. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose and stepped back first again. Of course. But this time, he looked frustrated by his own retreat. I don't know how to do this slowly, he admitted quietly. I blinked. What? His gaze stayed fixed somewhere near my shoulder now. Every instinct I have is telling me to either leave the room, he paused, or kiss you. Well, that completely destroyed my ability to think. The silence afterward felt enormous. My heartbeat was suddenly loud enough to hear. Brooks, I said carefully. I know. No, I really don't think you do. That finally made him look at me again. And something about the expression on my face must have undone the last bit of control he had left. Because Brooks crossed the distance between us so suddenly it stole my breath. Not reckless. Not rough. Careful. Almost unbearably careful. One hand settled lightly against my waist like he was still giving me room to stop this. But I didn't. God, I didn't. Brooks leaned his forehead briefly against mine, eyes closed, breathing uneven for the first time I'd ever seen. You are a terrible idea, he murmured softly. You're one to talk. That actually made him laugh quietly against my forehead. And the tenderness in that tiny sound nearly ruined me completely. For one suspended second, neither of us moved. Then Brooks kissed me. Softly. Carefully, like a man terrified of breaking something fragile. But underneath all that restraint was months of tension finally giving way. His hand tightened slightly at my waist. Mine caught briefly against his sleeve. The entire world narrowed into warmth and quiet, and the realization that Brooks kissed exactly like he lived cautiously at first, until emotion overwhelmed caution entirely. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke immediately. Brooks stayed close enough that I could still feel his breath. Then quietly, almost like the confession surprised even him, he said, I think I started falling for you the first time you laughed at me in this kitchen. And honestly, that might have been the exact moment I fell completely too.